Good morning, everyone. Welcome to TSN English class. This is your chapter number 5, Mother's Day, from the book Snapshot. And this is a play where, in this situation, the wife is telling some kind of truth to her husband. And let's see what's happened up next. This is a page number 46. Mrs. Pearson's. Severely possible you do, but what I doubt is whether your opinion worth having. What do you know? Nothing. You spend too much time and good money at greyhound races and dirt tracks and ice shows. Here, Mrs. Pearson, she's trying to tell her son that what you do. Don't think about your father here. What you do, probably you do, but what I doubt is whether your opinion worth having. जो भी तुम करते हो, it's according to you, it's good, but in my opinion, it is not having too much worth. And what do you know? Nothing. तुम्हें क्या पता है? तुम कुछ भी नहीं जानते हो. Because you spend too much time. Because you spend your time on worthless things and good money at greyhound races, and you are spending your time on greyhound. Here greyhound is a type of breed of dogs, so you are spending your time in worthless things and dirt tracks and ice show. And this shows me very well that you are spending your time on dirt tracks. Here धूल भरी सड़कों पर, the tracks which are full of dirt and the ice shows, और बर्फ के जो shows होते हैं you are, और जो snowy shows होते हैं that you are wasting your time over there and your money over there. So you are basically, that mother, she is trying to explain to her son that you are wasting your time on useless things. Cyril sulkily, well, what if I do? I have got to enjoy myself somehow. Have not. Here Cyril is saying that, okay, that whatever I doing, my mother, that I will enjoy all these things. So next, Mrs. Pearson, I would not mind so much if you really enjoy yourself, but are you? And where's it getting you? There is a sharp, hurried knocking heard of left. Here, Mrs. Pearson is saying that I don't think, my dear son, that you are really enjoying. You are doing all these things because your company or your friends are doing all these things, but you are not enjoying it at all. So she is asking a question with her son that, are you enjoying, my dear? No, you are just copying your friends. And where it getting you? And look at all these things, that you are going on to dirt tracks and you are taking part in this greyhound races. This will make you a bad one, and this will not actually giving you a worth, and these are the worthless things for you. And after that, डोर पे, उनकी डोर पे कोई नॉक करता है. Cyril, might be for me, I will see. Then Cyril is saying that somebody is here at the door, I will see who is there. Cyril hurries out left. In a moment he re-enters, closing the door behind him. Cyril गेट खोलता है and after that वो वापस से आ जाता है, closing the door behind him. Is it? It's that silly old bag from next door, Mrs. Fitzgerald. You don't want her here, do you? Then he's saying that there is a old lady. She looks like a, and there is a old lady and she looks like a silly old bag, and her name is Mrs. Fitzgerald. You don't want her here, do you? क्या आप उन्हें घर बुलाना चाहती हैं? Mrs. Pearson, sharply, certainly. Yes, I do. Ask her in, and don't call her a silly old bag either. She is a very nice woman with a lot more sense than you will ever have. Then Mrs. Pearson is saying, don't call that lady that she is a fool. She is a nice lady, and please tell her to come in, and don't ever call her that she is a silly old bag. She is a very, very nice lady, and she is having more brains, or she is much more sensible than you, my dear son George, my dear son Cyril. Cyril exits left. Mrs. Pearson finishes her stout, smacking her lips. Cyril re enters left, ushering in Mrs. Fitzgerald, who hesitates in the doorway. Cyril वहाँ से चला जाता है. Mrs. Pearson finishes her stout. Entry finishes her liquor. Mrs. Pearson. And she's smacking her lips means she's just licking her lips. Cyril re-enters left, and from left side Cyril enters in the home. Ushering in is Mrs. Fitzgerald, and then he saw Mrs. Fitzgerald, who hesitates in the doorway, जो डोर पर आने से थोड़ा सा हिचकिचाती हैं. Come in, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Here Mrs. Pearson is saying that come inside, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Mrs. Fitzgerald. Moving to left center anxiously. वो स्टेज के लेफ्ट सेंटर में आती हैं. I just wondered if everything all right. And here she's saying that I'm surprised that everything is okay over here, my dear Pearson. Cyril, sulkily, no, it is not. Then Cyril is giving reply that not Mrs. Fitzgerald. Nothing is okay over here in our home. Mrs. Pearson, sharply, of course it is. You be quiet. Mrs. Pearson is saying that Cyril, you should be quiet and everything is okay here, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Cyril, indigently and loudly, why should I be quiet? Then Cyril is giving reply, and he is angrily, or he is giving reply in a very loud voice. So he said that why should I be quiet? मैं चुप नहीं रहने वाला, and there is no need for me to quiet. Mrs. Pearson, shouting, because I tell you to, you silly spoiled young pecan. Here she is saying, because मैं कह रही हूँ तुमसे चुप रहने के लिए, and you are looking like a silly, a fool boy, and you look like a spoiled young pecan. And तुम ऐसा लग रहा है जैसे बिगड़े हुए कचौरी के डिब्बे हुए. Here pie can means pie is कचौरी and can is डिब्बा. So pie can is you look like a pie can and you are a worthless boy because you are silly and fool. Mrs. Fitzgerald protesting nervously. Oh no, surely. Mrs. Fitzgerald कहती है oh no surely. Mrs. Pearson severely, now Mrs. Fitzgerald just let me manage my family in my own way please. Mrs. Pearson जो है Mrs. Fitzgerald को रिप्लाई करती हैं that please let me handle my family in my own way. Mrs. Fitzgerald, yes, but Cyril. Okay, but what about Cyril? Cyril, sulkily and glowering, my Mrs. Cyril Pearson's too, you please, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Cyril stalks off into the kitchen. Here, Cyril जो है उसका face थोड़ा red हो जाता है, and then he's saying that for you, Mrs. Cyr Pearson, here जो मिसेस फिtzgerald हैं वो थोड़ी सी परेशान हो जाती हैं, एंड सिरिल जो है वो किचन के अंदर एंटर कर जाता है. देन व्हाट्स हैपन, लेट्स मूव ऑन to next page, page number 47. Mrs. Fitzgerald moving to the city whispering, oh dear, what's happening? And then Mrs. Fitzgerald जो है वो सोफे के पास जाती हैं and she asked her friend Mrs. Pearson, oh dear, what happened? Mrs. Pearson calmly, nothing much, just putting them in their places, that's all, doing what you ought to have done long since. Mrs. Pearson is saying that nothing dear, I just want to show their place to them, and I didn't, which you want me to do for so long time. Mrs. Fitzgerald, is George home? She sits beside Mrs. Pearson's on the settee. Mrs. Fitzgerald asked, क्या जॉर्ज घर पर है? So जॉर्ज भी मिसेस पियर्सन के पास सोफे पर बैठा होता है. He sitting beside Mrs. Pearson. Mrs. Pearson, yes, I have been telling him what they think of him at the club. And here Mrs. Pearson is trying to tell her friend Mrs. Fitzgerald that yes, I told everything about George, that what people or how people making fun of him in the club. Mrs. Fitzgerald, well, they think a lot of him, don't they? वो उसके बारे में कुछ ज़्यादा ही सोचते हैं, don't they? Mrs. Pearson, no, they don't. एंड हाउ ही नोज इट. मिसेस पियर्सन कहती हैं नहीं वो ऐसा नहीं करते हैं, अब वो इसे जानता है. एंड नाउ ही नोज एवरीथिंग. मिसेस फिजरल नर्वसली ओ डियर आई विश यू हैड नॉट. मिसेस फिजरल कहती ओ डियर काश तुमने ये सब नहीं किया होता. मिसेस पियर्सन नॉनसेंस, डूइंग देम ऑल अ वर्ल्ड ऑफ गुड and they will be eating of your own hand soon, you will see. Mrs. Pearson कहती हैं this is all foolish and whatever I told him, this is for his own benefit, and if he won't stops there, or I won't tell all these things about him, then soon he will on eating out of your own hand son. Hand soon, that means वो उनके ही बातों पे ज़्यादा विश्वास करता है या उनके ही कहने पर ज़्यादा चलता है. इट्स लाइक दैट. मिसेस फिजरल आई डोंट थिंक आई वॉन्ट देम ईटिंग आउट ऑफ माई हैंड. देन मिसेस फिजरल इज सेइंग कि मैं नहीं चाहती कि मैं उनको अपनी बात मनवाऊँ. हियर ईटिंग ऑफ माई हैंड मीन्स मैं अपनी बात उनसे मनवाना नहीं चाहती. मिसेस पियर्सन इम्पेशेंटली वेल वॉट एवर यू वॉन्ट दे विल बी डूइंग ऑल थ्री ऑफ देम मार्क माई वर्ड्स. मिसेस पियर्सन. मिसेस पियर्सन उनसे इम्पेशेंटली बोलती हैं कि वॉट एवर यू वॉन्ट वो तीनों यानी मेरे माई सन डॉटर एंड माई हस्बैंड दे विल डू द सेम वॉट एवर यू वॉन्ट. George enters left gloomily. He is unpleasantly surprised when he sees the visitor. He moves to the armchair left, sits down heavily, gloomily lights his pipe. Then he looks from Mrs. Pearson to Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is regarding him anxiously. And here is the scene in the play where George जो है वो entry करता है and he looks very sad. And वो देखता है there is a lady who is in his home, that Mrs. Fitzgerald. Then he sat in his armchair. वो अपनी armchair पे बैठ जाता है and he lights his pipe or lights his pipe and he is having a heavy heart. George just looked in for a minute, I suppose, Mrs. Fitzgerald. वो Mrs. Fitzgerald को कहता है that I think आप कुछ मिनटों के लिए यहाँ आई होंगी. Mrs. Fitzgerald, who does not know what she is saying. Well, yes, I suppose so, George. Then Mrs. Fitzgerald, that Mrs. Pearsons don't know that what she is saying, and I will realize all these things. George, aghast. George. Mrs. Fitzgerald nervously, oh, I am sorry. So George जो है वो थोड़ा सरप्राइज्ड हो जाता है. एंड देन मिसेस फिजरल कहती प्लीज़ आई एम सेइंग सॉरी टू यू. मिसेस फिजरल इम्पेशेंटली व्हाट डज इट मैटर. मिसेस पियर्सन व्हाट डज इट मैटर. योर नेम जॉर्ज इजंट इट. व्हाट डू यू थिंक यू आर अ ड्यूक ऑफ एडिनबर्ग. सो मिसेस पियर्सन अपने हस्बैंड को कहती हैं कोई फ़र्क नहीं पड़ता जॉर्ज, तुम्हारा नाम जॉर्ज है एंड यू आर what do you thinking of yourself that you are Duke of Edinburgh. क्या तुम अपने आप को एडिनबर्ग का ड्यूक समझते हो. जॉर्ज एंग्रीली what he got to do with it, just tell me that. And is it not it bad enough without her calling me George. No tea. Pompey Pearson and poor Doris has been crying her eyes out upstairs. Yes, crying her eyes out. And George कह रहा है अपनी वाइफ से that जो तुमने मुझसे पहले कहा that is not enough for you, that you are saying again and again things to me. And what do you mean by Duke of Edinburgh? I'm not thinking myself of that. And तुमने मुझे इतना कुछ कह दिया. You won't prepare a tea for me. You are calling me Pompey Pearson, George, poor Doris, and your daughter Doris. She is crying upstairs. This is not enough for you. Fitzgerald, oh dear, I ought to have known. देन मिसेस फिजरल कहती हैं मुझे ये सब कुछ पता कर लेना चाहिए था. जॉर्ज स्टेरिंग एट हर अनॉयड, यू ऑट टू हैव टू नोन. वाई ought you to have known? Nothing to do with you, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Look, we are at 6s and 7s here just now, so perhaps you will excuse us. Here, George जो है Mrs. Fitzgerald से कहते हैं that and he is staring Mrs. Fitzgerald and he is in an annoying stage. So he asked Mrs. Fitzgerald that आपको जानकर क्या फ़ायदा होगा, and what's there is nothing relate with you Mrs. Fitzgerald, and जो भी हो रहा है हमारे घर पे that is all kind of a mess. Mrs. Pearson. Before Mrs. Fitzgerald can reply, I won't excuse you, George Pearson. Next time a friend and neighbors come to see me, just say something when you see her, good evening, how do you do, or something. And don't just march in and sit down without a word. It's bad manners. Here Mrs. Pearson is trying to teach her husband that please behave nicely whenever somebody else or some neighbors or some friend of mine came to home, just please behave nicely with her and said good morning or good evening to her, how do you do. Don't just start doing all these things and don't complain her about our family matters. Mrs. Fitzgerald, no, it's all right. Then reply Mrs. V. Pearson, no, it is not all right. We all have done some decent manners in this house, or I will know the reason why. एंड मिसेस पियर्सन कह रही हैं हम सभी को इन घर में अच्छी आदतें सीखनी होंगी, और जॉर्ज की तरफ देखते हुए कहती हैं वेल आई विल नो वाई. जॉर्ज वेल व्हाट. जॉर्ज कहता है, थोड़ा सा डर जाता है, एंड ही इज सेइंग वेल व्हाट. मिसेस पियर्सन taunting him, why don't you get off your club? Special night tonight, isn't it? They will be waiting for you, wanting to have a good laugh. Go on them, don't disappoint them. Then Mrs. Pearson is saying that your club members are waiting for you, George. Just go over there, spend your night, and people are waiting over there because they want to laugh at you. George, bitterly, that's right. Make me look silly in front of her now. Go on. Don't mind me. Sixes and seven. Poor Dora's been crying her eyes out, getting the neighbors in to see the fun. Suddenly losing his temper, glaring at Mrs. Pearson and shouting, all right, let's her hear it. What's the matter with you? Have you gone balmy or what? Then George जो है वो बहुत ज़्यादा गुस्सा हो जाता है, and he is like he shouted on his mother and on her wife, that's you want to show me, or you want to clear everything in front of the neighbors, and you are behaving in a very silly manner, and you are insulting me in front of our neighbors. Here your daughter is crying and her eyes are bulging out, so let's do the squirrel in front of the neighbors, and let's start, or you are behaving like a balmy lady or what. Mrs. Pearson jumping up savagely, if you shout at me again like that, George Pearson, I will slap your big fat silly face. Then Mrs. Pearson जो है अपने हस्बैंड की इस शाउटिंग और इसका जवाब देती हैं, और वो कैसे देती हैं, ही इज़ टेलिंग हर हस्बैंड दैट इफ़ यू आर शाउटिंग मी लाइक दिस, shouting on me like this, then surely I will slap on your big fat face. Mrs. Fitzgerald, oh no, please Mrs. Fitzgerald. तो मिसेस फिtzgerald उन्हें कहती हैं मिसेस पियर्सन प्लीज़ आप बैठ जाइए और शांत हो जाइए. जॉर्ज स्टेरिंग एट हर bewildered, either I am off my chump or you two are. How do you mean? No, please Mrs. Fitzgerald, look, you are Mrs. Fitzgerald, so why are you telling yourself to stop why you are not doing? So here Mrs. Fitzgerald is trying to control the situation, and George is asking again and again that Mrs. Pearson, what's going on here? Why are you telling yourself, Mrs. Pearson? क्या आप खुद को रुकने के लिए कह रही हैं इधर? एंड बिकॉज हियर इज़ द पर्सनैलिटी एक्सचेंज प्रोग्राम. सो मिसेस पियर्सन जो है, मिसेस फिtzgerald जो है, वो खुद ही को वहाँ मिसेस पियर्सन की जगह मिसेस फिtzgerald को रोकने की कोशिश कर रही हैं by saying her own name. Then George is a bit confused that why are you stopping yourself for doing all these things. So here he is confused in this, and their fights some more, the husband and wife, they are getting more aggressive in this paragraph.